think we're live. There we go.
Hey, squad.
Hello,
And we're
hello.
live.
How about those new cartoons?
I know. Good job, marketing team.
Check that out.
Let's crack it
Real
up.
official.
It got the
Brian
gray
just-
hair, the wrinkles. They got all of it just perfect in there.
Yeah. Brian DeSantis looks like spot on like you guys. It's pretty funny. I love it.
Got our COVID beards going though, so it's a little dated.
Yeah.
Love it. Well, Doug, thanks for joining us this time on our little security squad here at Triden Group.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. So, I don't know, Derek, do you want to kick off some intros?
Sure. Yeah. Since we have a couple of newcomer to the group, I'll start off. Derek Poker over here, CTO, one of the co-founders for Triden Group. Looking forward to chatting with everybody. I think we have some good topics, and a guest on the show, and should be quite good. Brian.
Awesome. So I'm Brian Gibbs. I'm our newly appointed CISO, so excited to have that role and help out Triden Group and our customers with all their security needs overall. So excited to be here. Sammy?
Yeah. Nice introduction, guys. Yeah, my name's Sammy Marar. I'm a senior security principal here at Triden Group, and I work alongside Derek and Brian to help deliver all an array of cybersecurity assessments and services to our clients. And I'm excited to talk some shop today.
How about yourself, Douglas?
So Doug Brush, based out of Boulder, Colorado, work for Splunk, where I'm a global security advisor. So I basically work with organizations to help them kind of achieve their goals. The way I kind of look at it, it's almost like I'm a personal trainer. Get brought in to say, hey, where do you want to go? Do you want to run a 10K or an Ironman? But I'll keep you real on what your goals are and help you get there.
Love it. Cyber evangelist, right? Always something to talk about.
Always something to talk about. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
So a quick little side tip on Splunk. So I'm a TA at Georgia Tech, and one of the courses that we have is security incident response, and we're actually using Splunk as one of the projects to go figure out how a WordPress attack occurred. So it's pretty cool to dig through that and see how you can really find all that data.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that we have now in incident response that we didn't have 10, 12 years ago is we do not have a shortage of data. It's gotten pendulum swung so far the other way. It's like, oh crap, now we have too much data. What do we do with it all?
Right. Yeah,
That's a big problem.
A lot of these companies have just, they kind of keep data just to kind of keep data for sometimes on these sakes. And it's just, a lot of times not beneficial, right? And it's just, causes more regulation, more compliance issues, more retention issues, and it can really kind of come back to, bite you, so to speak. So it's just crazy how much information companies and people are producing now. It's wild.
A lot of it was I think it was our own fault within security and privacy and compliance for years, because we said, hey, set these arbitrary log retentions because we would go into IR situations and find there was no data. We know that the dwell time could be 150 days or so. So we say, okay, well, maybe keep a year's worth of data.
Right.
Well, what are you going to do with it? Well, we won't know until we know.
Right.
And then you have these large troughs of data, and then compliance comes in and says 3 years. Next thing you know, you're basically logging data for the sake of logging data that doesn't become actionable. And then you get very angry CISOs and SOC managers that go, well, great, now what am I supposed to do with it?
Yeah. We see that quite a bit, actually. So it makes a lot of sense.
Fun stuff. So I know first on the agenda was talking about the Florida water treatment plant and really going into that attack a little bit. It's definitely an interesting one where, TeamViewer was used, the same password was recycled. Something else I even heard about is the value that they set for it was something that the system couldn't even do, right? So I think it brings up a lot of questions around like input validation and things like that you need to consider when you write applications, because why would you even be allowed to put in a value that doesn't even do anything with the system overall? And then knowing that value was so high that it could cause damage to people, that's something else. Like, why isn't there an override in that system? Not just to mention the fact that TeamViewer with Windows 7 and all that was out in that environment.
Yeah, It's really, really tough and I've done a lot of work with municipal authorities, hundreds of them, in fact, and done incident response for them and proactive. And I feel for them. I mean, that's something where everybody. At first, I want to be please don't be TeamViewer. Please have it be behind a VPN and a firewall. And this was a sophisticated attack, and it was a target of opportunity because these things are, quite frankly, set up for a user to be able to do their job. So I know that right now there's some poor person who's feeling the weight of the world on the shoulder for just trying to do their job because they thought, hey, I have a wife, kids, whatever, I'm at home. This is a quick way for me to remote in, do my job.
Mm-hmm.
And it was set up for ease of use, not security. And now somebody's probably feeling the brunt of it. But that's, to me, that comes down as a leadership problem in design of why weren't the proper risk mitigation steps taken when designing that type of user access? And a lot of times it comes down to budget issues too. A lot of these organizations that work within critical infrastructure and muni authorities, they're on a shoestring budget. They have shared IT resources. Sometimes the departments I've supported, they've had, an admin that's maybe they're part-time, and it could be a he or she that answers the phone and does other types of work and then just does some IT work, while somebody else on an IT support line is telling her or him to click on things. So it's kind of a layered issue there. When we talk about layers of security, there was a technical issue, policy issues, procedures, people. There was a lot of failure right on the front end.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, a lot of these, smaller districts and whatnot, they don't have, like you said, a lot of resources, and oftentimes are shared. And, we do quite a bit of work with some local ones as well, and, see very similar activities and options around them. And, to your point, it's kind of like you're almost wishing it was this more sophisticated attack. And at the end of the day, it was like, not really. I guess the good news in some of this is there's other, safeguards in place to, help prevent the systems from mixing incorrectly and things like that. But it's pretty scary to think about when you kind of tell people like, hey, this is like, can potentially harm you or, kill you in some of these levels. And now you're kind of taking this, cyber world that people don't really understand and, people are hearing about and translating it to like a physical activity. It's pretty wild, right? I mean, whether it's power grid, water systems, SCADA systems, nuclear systems. I mean, it could be anything. And, it kind of really, puts things into perspective as to what can really happen with, cyber attacks and criticality of things like this.
Yeah, not to mention, I think we were pretty lucky to get a report on this in general because I know the county sheriff kind of came out and reported on this rather quickly, but there's only one law that applies to cybersecurity of water treatment facilities in the U.S., and that's the America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. And so that actually requires that for basically an infrastructure of more than 3,300 people to develop or update risk assessments and emergency response plans. However, most of these municipalities most of these water infrastructures aren't actually operating across that many people. It's actually more so you would see maybe a few hundred or a few thousand residents they're serving, which means in these situations, they're actually not obliged to report on these things, which could actually really just kind of pushes the can down the road and opens up the industry in general to a lot of vulnerabilities because if they have no incentive to report on these things, that's pretty scary because this was a major public health issue. And so I think there needs to be a little bit of legislation around perhaps some of our critical infrastructure like water districts and what regulatory requirements they should have around their actual systems and their response plans and their priority to share these things as they occur.
Definitely. And I even think of like what's going on in Texas right now, right? With not having all that electricity to be able to run and operate. I mean, obviously there's a little difference. I mean, it's sort of like a DDoS attack, right? Everybody started turning on their heat. All the power consumption went up. The wind power and the solar generation wasn't able to operate during the middle of that bad storm. And then you get this cascading effect, right? So some of the similar type of things that occur. And obviously I've already read this morning that there's a bunch of new regulation being looked at to go get put in place or revalidate the systems in general overall for the electric grid. But the same thing, can apply in the water districts as well, as we see.
Yeah, it's interesting. We kind of had these things almost back to back because it does shed the light on the the issues within the critical infrastructure, the lack of funding, and quite frankly, the lack of regulation around the IT systems and technology that supports them. And while sometimes you can be a little bit hesitant about reactionary legislation, maybe this is time to do it, but what could be good out of some of this too, what I think is underappreciated from an incident response perspective, is when there is increased regulation and laws around it, it creates a law enforcement action plan, so to speak. So when these things happen, it's not jurisdictional. Wait, who do I call? Is this local county sheriff that doesn't have a computer forensic department, or am I getting the FBI and Department of Homeland Security involved day one, second one, and going through those jurisdictional hurdles when there's new laws on the books can be reduced. And it could be something that allows us to be responding more quicker. And it's not necessarily just to prosecute, but just to provide that level of expertise for boots on the ground that local, law enforcement agencies, quite frankly, just don't have.
Yeah, that's a good point. Lots to come on this, right? I mean, it's just going to keep happening. So we'll see it evolve as time goes on.
Oh, yeah. So the next headline that we had to cover was about Microsoft and their estimation that there was over 1,000 developers that were involved in the SolarWinds malware breach. So that was a very interesting find and location on Microsoft. I guess they probably ran it through some of their AI tools to figure out how many people they believed went through and modified that code.
Yeah, I was reading some of the stats, from the interview, and it looks like Microsoft had around 500 or so of their engineers kind of pulling it apart and dissecting it. And, they found, I think it was just over 4,000 lines of code, something that has probably millions of lines of code that were altered and changed. And, I think it's kind of showing clearly that there's a lot more sophistication to this than, maybe we all kind of once thought, and, how things were unfolding. So it's pretty kind of wild to see that, this is a very sophisticated and, more and more things are coming out about this, that there was that much change to the code and, that many potentially, people in the cookie jar, so to speak, and actually actively changing and, modifying the code base and deploying it elsewhere. So it's pretty staggering, in my opinion, to kind of hear those types of numbers coming out of this.
Yeah, it's not, I think the important takeaway too is that was 1,000 potentially orchestrated developers. Right. They having stand-up Scrum meetings every 2 weeks. I mean, the fact that this was getting done with this level of sophistication also meant that there was organization, funding, coordination. You just don't get 1,000 people developing, randomly. So, this comes down to the idea that, the continued focus that, when you look at state-sponsored activities, as we're pretty sure that this is falling into, is that this is not just for, giggles or posting exploits online of, haha, look what I did. I mean, this was something that was very well coordinated with a lot of intent. And so once we start understanding those TTPs of what these types of threat actors are doing, it really kind of opens your eyes to level of sophistication they have to, not technical, that they're looking to monopolize and monetize things, getting access information or other systems in ways that is really well orchestrated on their back end. So who knows what they're running to really kind of manage all this? And, do they have what we would think is a traditional DevOps shop with Jira tickets and sprints? It's very well conceivably using traditional development cycles in a malicious way.
Yeah, and it really just pushes, everything forward, because as they've, as a result of this hack, I'm sure they've now developed on their techniques, have now gained access to new softwares from different vendors across the industry, and will likely be sitting on these for the next, state-sponsored attack. So, it breeds more of the same when these types of things happen. But then we can kind of analyze it and ask ourselves, what are the things that we can learn, and like you said, what are the TTPs that we can start to work against. But at the end of the day, I think it just speaks to the level of sophistication. I think the Microsoft president even claimed this to be, the largest, most sophisticated attack the world has ever seen. So, big stuff on that end.
By far. And then what else have they already infiltrated overall, right? If it's that size of group that's that orchestrated, and then when you think about like terms of service of these different platforms, like this morning I read that Reddit 6% of their posts were removed last year, so it's up over 5% from the year before. But if they're just actively working on code and it looks like sprints and it looks like normal behavior that would be occurring in a company, a Slack's not going to go remove that, right? So it looks like it's a legitimate use case of those tools and platforms, even though they're doing it for malicious reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, this was not a one and done thing. You put together this level of operation, you're going to target other organizations, use what works. They had understanding of, again, the development lifecycle of this particular organization, potential, contractors that they potentially could have used, dependency and code libraries that they now have access to. So there's a lot of other intel that this attack group gained that can be potentially used in other attacks for sure.
Yeah, and Doug, I think to your point, I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about, the orchestration and having to work together. I mean, most companies for profit can't even do this kind of stuff and do it well, and it takes some years to run or debug a program. So the fact that they can do this in such a short amount of time, it's kind of under the radar, so to speak, is just it's impressive, but also extremely scary at the same time, right?
Yeah, it definitely keeps you up at night wondering what kind of persistent access they still maintain, after the hacks. So I'm sure that a lot of the IR's teams went through and probably tried to clean up as much as possible and gain as many IOCs as possible. But at the end of the day, organizations that were compromised with possibly weaker or not as mature security programs are probably going to be, still affected by any persistent actors in their systems. So what that means into the future is also of particular interest, but should keep a lot of CISOs up at night for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, there is the supply chain portion attack of this, but really to get into unmonitored, unprotected code that goes through a regular development lifecycle of release, if you can do that at scale in other organizations and push out backdoors, then it's great if you can detect that 0 day, but once they're in, they're living off the land. They're going to blend in with traffic. This was just to get the toehold in and build in the back doors. Once they're in, it's that cockroach theme of just trying to get rid of them and out of every single corner.
Yeah, it's a good point because even also from a like a FireEye perspective, it kind of seems like that's really what happened, right? It's like, hey, we use SolarWinds to kind of get in, compromise some other accounts through getting in, adding ourselves to their two-factor, registering another device, and then able to kind of get in through things like that. So yeah, like kind of like we said before, is this is just a way to get in, and a tool like this that has access to pretty much everything in the network, it's quite far-reaching.
Yep. Well, it's interesting how FireEye went from, oh my goodness, this breach happened to them, they're going to tank, their stock price dropped a lot, to all of a sudden hero, right? To really uncovering this and bringing it out. And obviously they got the best of the best through their Mandiant acquisition to help them with their IR on this piece.
Yeah. More and more every day.
Well, I know our next topic is around Microsoft again here, but they added some phishing alerts to their forms. And I think that's critical to point out because it's to me, was such a loophole, right? That you could host forms up through SharePoint, make it look like it's legitimate website, SharePoint.com or on Microsoft.SharePoint.com or whatever the case is. And it looks legitimate. People put their guard down when things look like they're the right thing to do. And then all of a sudden you put your username and password in and then bam, they can get into your environment.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I've done far too many of these investigations. I mean, I couldn't even begin to count them. I mean, but it's such a common attack vector because, as you said, it brings the user's guards down. So like, oh, okay, I have to re-authenticate again. Let me just type in my username and password, and that stuff gets scraped. The underlying code on those backend forms is just basic JavaScript stuff that collects it, sends it out to another email address. I mean, it's a very easy attack to execute and then do at scale.
by
Almost like
far.
a simplified social engineering, right? I mean, it's kind of like, hey, here's this thing that looks good. Like you said, I'm already kind of logging in. Oh, it's Microsoft. Yeah, it must be fine. Okay, sure. Here it is again, and just you're off and running. So they kind of take the simplified approach and just ran with it. But it's definitely cool to see how they're adding a lot of this. And also, what's cool is they're adding it by default and turning it on. It's like, hey, this doesn't look right. We're going to flag it, alert you, unless this is, for some valid reason, which, probably isn't. At least kind of having that intelligence built into the platform, I think is good on Microsoft's part to continue to enhance their cloud platforms and security tools.
Yep. And if you think about all the corporate security training that goes out there, why do you think 80-90% of that training is all around phishing? Right? Because that's the biggest loophole is it's the people. Right? At the end of the day, it's a human factor of being weak to going in and clicking those buttons or putting the data into something that they shouldn't put in.
Well, it's such a timeless strategy too, because as organizations grow, new employees come in who may or may not have this information, this knowledge. People entering the workforce who may not have this knowledge. Vendors that you may contract that may not have this level of of awareness. And so it's timeless. The strategies just keep changing. You come up with more complicated pretexts with that taps more into the human psychology, and then over time these things just develop. You can't get rid of email completely because it's a fundamental function to any business. So it's like it comes down to really using as many security controls as you can, but combining that with that security awareness. It's a continuous effort. And I don't think it's something we're going to ever have a silver bullet solution to, other than ongoing security awareness training, phishing simulations, and really just getting very used to the lay of the land that we currently are in.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's to your point, though. It's good that Microsoft is putting some of this stuff on by default. I think traditionally, particularly in Office 365, I mean, if you look at the way that you can set up a admin account, there was no requirement to 2FA on it. I mean, it was very easy to set up a single factor admin account and forget about it. And so that's always been kind of my gripe with Office 365. It's incredibly easy to use from an administrative perspective compared to legacy technologies. But just the things that should have been on security wise by default would have saved me many, many nights of sleep.
By far. Well, think about Teams, right?
A lot of money, yeah.
Teams out of the box, you can use external email addresses and chat with somebody. Well, you're going to let your guard down because your company's letting you use Teams most likely, and somebody messages you something and it could be spam and you don't realize it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just even from a data sprawl perspective, I mean, IMAP's enabled by default on the accounts. You can do forwarding external email address, just things that are mind-boggling that post-incident we have to go in and turn off, that are the first thing the attackers go after.
Yep, get that modern auth enabled, right? I know what TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are finally getting axed on that platform. I keep getting alerts, at least in our tenant, that it's finally coming, right?
Yeah,
I think I'm so TLS alert fatigued out of which one's coming and when at this point. just make it 1.3. But screw everybody. I don't want backwards compatibility in anything.
Start fresh.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's funny.
So, Doug, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, it's called Cybersecurity Interviews, and I've been running it now for just over 4 years. And it really kind of started from conversations like this at conferences. I would speak at a conference, go see my friends speak. And then the more meaningful discussions I found in the takeaways were in the lobby con or hallway con or, the bars and dinners afterwards, because we'd share more ideas and war stories. I'm like, gosh, this is the type of stuff we need to be capturing. And it was also that idea that, I would constantly get asked, hey, you've been doing this for a while. How do I get in the industry? What's the path? I'm like, I wish I knew. I mean, I think I volunteered to fix a printer one time in the 90s, and it's 40 years later, I don't know what the hell happened. It just kind of, you just find yourself in the industry. So it was really also kind of helped me in my imposter syndrome a little bit too, to talk to people like a Dave Kennedy, John Strand, and others that I kind of put on this pedestal, and have them say, hey, we don't know what the hell we're doing at times. Like we're always figuring this out. So I think it was a couple of those reasons to start it, just to have these conversations to draw out more information, but also share with others that there is no one way to get into this. And even the people that, again, that you consider gods in the industry, they have a lot of self-doubt at times. They don't have all the answers. Nobody does.
Yep. Well, that's the thing with cybersecurity is it's not one metric, right? So like a CIO with the uptime, that's easy, right? You got your 5 nines. That's an easy metric to have. But when it comes to the cybersecurity piece, what metric are you going to follow, right?
Yeah.
And so it's hard to have that type of
well,
report
it's easy.
card, if you will.
Just be invisible in the background and secure the enterprise with no budget. I mean, what's more.
How hard can it be?
Until you get breached, and then you get all the money you need in the world, right?
Well, yeah, and so one of the talk tracks I developed this year is on mental health and cybersecurity, because a lot of us have had burnout, or there's just been a huge problem with it. And if you look at just CISOs in general, there's a huge burden on their shoulders, where most of them feel that the breaches are inevitable, while their counterparts, their CEOs within the organization, don't. And so they're constantly under this gun. And then when the proverbial crap hits the fan, they're almost, I think it was like 90 something, almost 99% of them felt they were either going to be written up in some disciplinary way or lose their jobs. That's an incredible amount of pressure. And like I said, if you look at it from a CIO perspective, there's uptime and metrics that were pretty well understood in IT. Mm-hmm. But when a system go down or your power grid gets taken out, lives are at stake. They don't train us for that. And that's a lot of stress.
Definitely. That's why I always lead with, it's not if, but it's when you get breached, right? So protect, detect, respond. We really need to focus on the whole detect piece of the pie. So much money is spent on protection that you need to know when you get breached and how to stop it as soon as you can inside that environment, because that's what's going to reduce your risk and not going to have a big tarnishment on your environment or your brand, I should say.
Yeah. And an alternative, I mean, it's part of a mature program is, you put on alerting and detection, but how do you reduce that noise? Because throwing more human bodies at it, more human hours, is not sustainable. And we've clearly seen it doesn't work. And so it's like, how do you kind of separate the needles from the needles within the needles in the haystack? And that's the hard part.
Yeah, I know me and Derek kind of spoke back and forth about this not too long ago, and we're talking about how, coming into a lot of organizations, it just seems to be like one of the major issues there is just asset classification, asset identification, and then proper segmentation of all these devices and this data. It's like you can kind of reduce the alert fatigue if you're spending your time on that critical infrastructure, the critical assets, the critical applications. And so when you're kind of missing that first step of even just understanding what your own ecosystem entails and what's involved, it makes it much more difficult from a reactionary standpoint to actually mitigate these issues. And so I think that's kind of plays into exactly what you're saying, and is a lot of the reason why we're seeing these issues today.
Well, yeah, there's the fundamentals haven't changed. Mm-hmm. Proper network segmentation, knowing what you have, what data is on it with the right classification, who has access to it. There's just no product that could do it. I wish I can say, hey, buy Splunk and it's done. It's not. It's a process. There's no tool that does it. And it's a process, and it's beyond a marathon. I mean, at least marathons have endings. I mean, that is just a lifetime, hill you're just never getting to the top of. But it's part of what needs to be done is really making sure that you have the proverbial crown jewels segregated in ways that they're protected, because you can't have visibility across everything all this time. And look, I love the idea of the zero trust model, but it also introduces its own set of issues, because a entirely flat universe of devices is not always manageable in alerting and detecting. So you do need to do the good old fashioned of what you have and making sure it's protected, and only the right people have access to it.
Definitely. I see that Mr. Wells put a little comment out there about finding the needle is one thing, knowing what to do with it once you find it's another.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Or even if you're holding a needle, sometimes, I mean, it's, again, if a good attacker's in your network, they're blending in, and, how do you know this is a good needle versus a bad needle?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Constantly evolving, and, things are always changing. And to your point, it's like a marathon that never ends, some crazy version of Groundhog's Day that we seem to put ourselves through, and, definition of insanity. But, at some point, we have to kind of just keep doing what we're doing. And, I think we're all a little crazy to be in this field and, see how things change and constantly fight the good fight for at least what it's worth.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes to, accepting that it is a process and not something that's going to have a silver bullet solution to. I mean, like you're kind of saying, it's like, I feel like a lot of our approach has been, what is the solution or the tool that can do this particular function for us, that can do the segmentation identification and the asset identification. It's like, it doesn't exist. It's an ongoing procedural thing. And I know that shift in that mindset, I think, reduces a lot of the anxiety on behalf of the engineers who are looking at this and are trying to make sense of it all, but at the same time ensures that we actually have efficiency moving forward and not just relying on a single silver bullet solution to actually do these things. Because I think that's the pitfall of a lot of organizations, and not just from an asset management perspective, but from every layer of the security model, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times it's like an organization thinks their endpoint detection software is going to be enough to keep them protected. So it's that's a big aspect to it. I think it's just moving away from that mindset.
Even with EDR tools. I mean, like, look, you can put a lot of stuff on the endpoints because that's where the attacks typically pivot from. But again, it gets down to there's a ton of noise. It's not going to be the answer. It's like, how are you going to operationalize that information in ways that's meaningful to your overall program? And this idea, this very narrow focused of, well, we'll work on this and we're going to put all our time and effort to fixing this, and then this doesn't equate to any outcomes. Who cares? It's like, you really need to drive it by the business outcomes.
Yep. Or you're working on this, but it's really over here, right? And so you don't realize that's where they go after.
And that's a tough part of security leadership too. I mean, if you look at, again, the infancy, or really, where I think where security's in its teenage years, a lot of the challenges the CISOs face is coming from maybe an IT background and not having the support or the voice supported inside the organization to push back on people. When I've gone in and performed as a CISO, and I've been interim CISO in a couple of organizations, it took me, 6 months to a year to really kind of continue to push on IT to find out, okay, what is the critical asset? And it's finally a web app that's processing 90% of the business. I was like, why have we not talked about this? Well, we just didn't think it was a big issue. I was like, no, it's the issue. It's the issue that keeps everybody's jobs. So why are we not focusing on that? And it was like, because it was a thorny issue. It was an old legacy web app, and they knew that it was going to be a pain in the ass to convert it. And people just didn't want to know. And so they were able to just kind of hide the ball as long as they could until I kind of, shown the proverbial black light on it.
It's scary how often that probably really happens, right? You have a lot of these customers, legacy technical debt. It's kind of like, well, don't look over here because it's all kind of nasty, but look over here where it's pretty. But but over here is like you said, this is like the important part of the business. So it happens.
Oh man, it brings back a nightmare of a story at I got to be careful what I say, but the box was essentially named a dev box, right? And so that dev box actually got put into production, and it was a very critical business piece of the pie that actually ran the data to be able to get paid every month, right?
Sweet.
So
probably sitting under somebody's desk.
And so
I've never heard a story like this before. Oh my God.
We just patched it in the middle of the day because it was a dev box, right? Like, it was in our first group of patching to get done to test and validate patching. And one day the box never came back on. Nobody could understand why, right?
Yeah, it's dev.
Production. I had one sales org put 6 of their dev images that was on one hypervisor into production because the sales team just said, hey, look, we need this set up for customer demos now. And because there was money attached to it, everything else went out the window. And sure enough, I mean, it was like the most junior hack the box Apache server popping, and they hit one, and this took 6 of them down in about 10 minutes. My incident response report was like 2 pages, basically kind of calling out sales. Like, this was BS. Like, you should have never let this happen. And there really wasn't, there's very little sophistication, but it wasn't an IT problem. It was a business problem.
Yeah.
Yep. It's too easy to go slide that credit card with the cloud.
Yeah.
So speaking of money, the cryptocurrencies, as we close out here talking about that. So that most cryptocurrency money laundering goes through a few addresses. I thought that was a very interesting find. Yeah,
I've seen some really interesting levels of sophistication with I mean, it's it does what it's supposed to do. It keeps people anonymous. And there are some other block analysis and chain analysis that people are doing now to kind of see where this stuff moves. But it's it's a really interesting how they're disguising it through multiple layers of obfuscation so you can't get tracked. And it does what it's supposed to do. I mean, and that again is driving the business, and with the values that they are now, I wouldn't see why people would not continue to use that.
Yeah. The whole decentralization of the currency. I think that's one of the big drivers. Listening to CNBC last night and seeing where the value of Bitcoin, it finally broke 51,000. So, I won't give any investment advice to go put your money in anything, right? Because it could tank back down like it has done in the past. You just never know. But if you do go set up a Bitcoin environment, make sure that you go to a reputable source and you have a backup of your wallet, right? There's so many people now that have lost their keys that can't get their wallets, and they've lost millions of dollars gone, right?
Yeah. Horror stories around that kind of stuff. But it's interesting, because it's almost like this, 80-20 rule, right? Where it's like, hey, 80% of the funds is kind of going through 20% of the exchanges. So I think to your point, Doug, it's like, what's really happening here. And I was kind of reading some articles around it and, looking at the transactions, and, tons of it's around ransomware payouts, dark web payouts, gambling. So I think we're going to see more and more of these types of, like you said, multiple layered, hiding things in plain sight, shifting around with, legitimate, kind of exchanges and funds. And now that kind of this whole, crypto craze has kind of gone, mainstream, and, like my parents even talk about it, right? So it's gone so mainstream now that, I think a lot of people don't really understand the, dark side, if you will, of crypto, and kind of, I don't want to say how it got started, but, what it was really used for, and, ransomware and payments and things like that. So we're going to see more and more of that. And it was interesting. I guess one of the stats was saying that the listed exchanges were taking between $1 and $100 million worth of cryptocurrency a year. So, these aren't small numbers here. These are pretty big, and again, they're probably sophisticated organizations that specialize in these types of activities and how to, move the money around, or move, the actual coins around, if you will. So, pretty interesting.
The other crazy part too is, I think as these start to develop, we're going to start to see not only decentralized tokens, but the act of, I guess, tumbling or mixing these Bitcoins themselves will start to become decentralized as peer-to-peer tumblers actually start to come into existence, where basically users will arrange the mixing of the Bitcoin wallets themselves. So there's actually no middleman. So this is kind of like the evolution of this, where it's like first we had these cryptocurrency tumblers or these exchanges that would kind of do it and then charge maybe like a 1 to 3% fee to kind of help you launder your money or do whatever it is that you're trying to do illegally. Well, now there's peer-to-peer networks for that. So tracing back to, because I think one of the things that I read was that we're actually law enforcement's in a fairly good position right now, because the amount of tumblers, there are a very few amount of these tumblers. So if they're able to compromise one of these organizations, it should actually affect a lot of the people who use this server illicitly. A much larger percentage due to that 80-20 rule, like you were saying. But with that peer-to-peer model, it's going to start to become very difficult to do that. So and from my perspective, I think one of the biggest things that we're going to start to see is regulation in this industry, which may also be one of the bigger, downfalls of it potentially, or at least a lot of people that speculate about cryptocurrency suspect that this may be one of the biggest hurdles that it has in its mainstream adoption. So
yeah, OFAC, which is kind of a regulatory control from Department of Treasury against foreign money laundering, really kind of had to step up their. They really didn't come down heavy as far as what they said they were going to do, but at least, start looking at things more closely about people that are paying. It's not just money laundering, but basically funding foreign terrorist groups. So basically, if because again, it's anonymous money, you have some wallet ID reputation, you have some things that trace it, but where's that money really going? And so they're saying, look, if companies and organizations are going to continue to pay ransomware demands, in 6-7 figures, are you potentially funding terrorism? I mean, is this going to have a blowback effect? Right. So they were starting to say, look, we can't let this go on forever. Really got to figure this out. it's going to be interesting to see if they continue to try to enforce that, or what other law enforcement agencies, whether international or domestic, are going to get further involved to try to further identify the owners of these wallets, particularly ones that are part of a common attack groups, whether it be a Ryuk or any of the other ones that are out now. Because if they can do a coordinated effort to take one of these groups down, maybe it can seriously defund them and remove that payment operation.
Yeah, totally. And then on the flip side of it too, we've kind of talked a little bit about a lot of the kind of the darker side and the dark money that's coming into this, but man, the amount of institutional investing that's coming to Bitcoin, I think, is really what's driving this price to kind of astronomical levels. I mean, I think in the past 10 days, BlackRock investment management company, Tesla threw a $1.5 billion purchase in there. MicroStrategies announced this morning that they're about to issue about $900 million worth of corporate bonds so that they can buy more Bitcoin with it. The Grayscale, PayPal is going to enable payments. BitPay already enabled it via MasterCard for Apple Pay. I mean, it's the institutions are coming in, and it's going to be interesting to see where we fall, because on your one hand you have like this darker side of it that's kind of unregulated and fuels a lot of, like you said, maybe terrorist related activities or just money laundering or illegal things in general. But on the other hand, you have major brand name institutions that are trying to get involved in enabling payments for Bitcoin. And so what does this mean going into the future? It's really interesting to watch, honestly.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a year ago we thought our commodity markets were going to be driven by toilet paper. Who knew it was going to be GameStop? And 2020 hindsight, I guess.
Yeah, it's
nice. Funny. Toilet paper and water and paper towels. Wow, who would have known?
Leads to $51,000 in Bitcoin, right? It's crazy.
Yeah, I'd say it's a year ago, man. We've got to get that Back to the Future time machine and say, I know this sounds really weird, but just buy all the cryptocurrency right now.
Yeah.
I know. I was kind of digging into my old emails from like 2012, trying to find somewhere where I spent a Bitcoin or something. Yeah, some online video game. Yeah.
Nice.
But no, even I think outside of Bitcoin too, so many alternative coins are taking off as well as a result. I think it's just, it's kind of the result of the Bitcoin or the crypto hype in general. But a lot of these actually have really practical applications. If you particularly Ethereum is one of those that's actually uses to power digital contracts, decentralized software. So I'm from a technology perspective, I'm actually curious to see how those types of things will kind of transform our world, not just a store of value, but the smart contracts, if you will, and decentralized software. That's it's quite attractive to our industry, at least.
Yeah,
you mean the DocuSigns of the world might not make it?
That might be the case.
Let's say it'd be interesting if we see an uptick in more crypto miners. I've definitely seen them in IR investigations. I always feel bad for those little guys because they're like, there's somebody's gotten in there, they got all their processes hidden and make sure the malware doesn't catch them. This quietly running in the background, and then some other attacker will come in and then alert everybody, and they ruin their crypto mining operations. But you got to imagine that that's going to be a target. There's an incredible amount of value in that now. And look, if I don't have to do anything but pop AWS hosts and leak off, CPU cycles, because anybody that's ever read an AWS or Azure billing statement, there's good luck trying to figure out if there's extra processes running in there.
Right. But yeah, I think there are literally services and organizations popping up that will pretty much run these existing botnets, and will allow you to add that service on for a nominal fee and mine Bitcoin on infrastructure of somebody else. So, that's another dark web service that you can kind of leverage and,
professional business out there, right? I mean, that's really what it is.
Definitely. So any closing thoughts as we wrap?
Another interesting week in cyber world. And
it's going to be an interesting year for sure. I think there's still a lot of these long tail effects of things from SolarWinds we're going to continue to see. The infrastructure that, if you followed anything that Robert E. Lee and Dragos and Leslie Carhart's been saying for, 5 years that, oh my gosh, we're heading towards a cliff. I mean, we're kind of getting towards it. So, it's the things that you know about or you find out about that get alerted about are the ones you respond to. It's still fearful to me of all the things that, based on what we're seeing now on these, like I said, these more prevalent attacks that we talked about earlier, what else is out there that we don't know about? And are we going to see more of those in the coming months?
Definitely. Yeah. My challenge, or my CISO challenge of the week here, would be go enable 2FA on one account that you don't have it turned on today. Right?
Smart move.
Just start somewhere. You got to move your personal needle forward. So even if it's your personal bank or your Gmail or Yahoo or whatever that you utilize, go out there and enable it on at least one account. Amazon, eBay, PayPal, something. Go out and enable the 2FA and start improving your posture. Well, thanks everybody for joining this week. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks everybody. Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, thanks for coming,
take
Doug.
Take care. See you guys next time.
Bye.